And so I'm super excited to have an event on Sylvia Pankhurst tonight, who reminds us that it was just the suffragettes in the US who were kind of shitty. And that actually another way of thinking about women's liberation at the time was really possible, one that connected to other struggles in an expansive sense of solidarity. And Katherine Connelly has done an amazing job not only of writing about Sylvia Pankhurst, but also of, in this project, A Suffragette in America, recovering, I think, a formerly unpublished work detailing Sylvia Pankhurst's encounter with the United States, which we're here to hear about tonight. So please join me in welcoming Katherine Connelly.
Okay, thank you very, very much, everybody, for coming. And thank you very much to Red Emmers. It's really special to be able to come and speak here. This is a lovely bookshop, and it feels very appropriate to take the book here. So thank you very, very much indeed for this. I'm going to talk a little bit about Sylvia Pankhurst herself and the tours that she undertook of the United States. And then I'll talk a little bit about the text that she wrote, this previously unpublished manuscript that has now been published, that I've edited and introduced. So to introduce Sylvia Pankhurst, first of all, this is her. This is a photograph taken of her on the first day that she arrived in the United States. And she was really somebody who was a lifelong political activist who never gave up on the struggle to change the world. We're going to be talking about her as an activist in the militant suffrage movement in Britain. But after that, she opposed the First World War. She was somebody that was tremendously inspired by the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, by the Bolshevik Revolution in particular, in 1917. Because of her enthusiasm for that and the fact that she founded the first Communist Party in Britain, the British government denied her a passport to try and stop her from participating in the big debates of communists in the aftermath of the First World War. And she was really at the heart of many of those debates. She had a very famous polemic with Lenin and was invited over to Moscow to have that debate with him. In her efforts to get abroad to participate in these debates, she did things like she smuggled herself into a small fishing boat to travel all the way across the North Sea. On another occasion, she crossed over the Alps from Italy into Germany in the middle of the night. She was a lifelong anti-racist. She was, for much of her life, an editor of radical newspapers. And in that capacity, she was in Britain the first newspaper editor to employ a black journalist. She was a lifelong anti-imperialist. And she was also, in Britain, one of the first people to identify the dangers of the rise of fascism. So at a time when Winston Churchill was saying that had he been an Italian, he would have voted for the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, Sylvia Pankhurst understood that that fascism was a movement that represented an existential threat to all of the causes that she dedicated her life to fighting for, whether that be women's rights, workers' rights, democracy, anti-racism, so on and so forth. And it was through her opposition to fascism that really led her to the last great cause of her life, when in 1935 fascist Italy invaded the African country of Ethiopia with the absolute complicity of the British and the French governments. And she dedicated the rest of her life to campaigning for freedom for Ethiopia, exposing the reality of the fascist occupation, reporting on the resistance movements in Ethiopia, and campaigning for its freedom. So she was a lifelong campaigner. I'm going to be talking about her in the militant suffrage movement, and in particular those few months that she spent here in the United States. So the Pankhurst family had a very particular role to play in the campaign for women's suffrage. Here is a section of the Pankhurst family. This is Sylvia over here. This is her mother, Emmeline Pankhurst, and her older sister, Christabel Pankhurst. Now, in 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst and Christabel Pankhurst founded a new campaigning organisation for Votes for Women. And what was different about this campaign was initially the kinds of women that they got involved. They involved women like the Pankhurst women involved in the early socialist movements. And they also involved women involved in the early trade union movements in Britain, so working class women. And they also were different in terms of the kind of tactics that they used. So these women used tactics of direct action and civil disobedience to draw attention to their cause. Sylvia Pankhurst was an active campaigner in that movement, and at the time that we meet her in 1911, she'd been in prison on 2 separate occasions for her involvement in that campaign. But as year after year went on, and as Votes for Women was not achieved, the movement started to change direction, particularly led by Emmeline and Christabel. They didn't give up on direct action, but what they did argue was that they needed to involve different kinds of women. And they explicitly made a very elitist argument that working class women, in their view, weren't clever enough, didn't have enough time, were too busy, weren't strong enough to lead the struggle. And they marginalized those women, and they argued that what they should be doing instead was to be getting elite women involved in the campaign, women who, if they got arrested, the newspapers would care because they already knew their names. Now, Sylvia Pankhurst, as a socialist, was fundamentally opposed to that direction that her mother and her sister were taking the campaign in. But she had a problem in terms of how to articulate that. The campaign was led by her family members, but also she knew the very high personal costs to women that were becoming activists in this campaign. It was very difficult for her to know how on earth she might criticize what was happening. And so she kept her disagreements to herself. But her family were very well aware of her disagreements with the direction they were taking the campaign. And they also decided that Sylvia would be best if she was kind of excluded or marginalized from the campaign. So they decided to ask her to write a history of the campaign, which she agreed to do. And this meant that she had a book deadline to meet, so she couldn't get arrested anymore and she couldn't go to prison, so she'd be out of the limelight of the campaign. And then when she finished the book, which was a very loyal book, they then decided that she ought to go and promote the book in North America. So literally they sent her a very, very long way away indeed. And for this reason, she undertook 2 tours of North America to talk about the women's suffrage movement in Britain. She came for 3 months at the beginning of 1911 and then another 3 months at the beginning of 1912. And here you can see this is the brochure that was produced for that 1912 tour. These were very, very extensive tours. She toured 19 different states and Washington, D.C. She went up into Canada, and she spoke here in Baltimore on the 28th of March, 1911. Sylvia spoke very nearby to here. In fact, she spoke very nearby indeed. She spoke next door in the Osler Hall. This was a meeting that was chaired by Emma Maddox-Funk, who was an important campaigner in Baltimore, a very talented musician, and she chaired the meeting, and that's where Sylvia spoke. I'm going to come back to the tours themselves and why they were so important and what she wrote about them in a minute, but I would just like to kind of think for a minute about what happens when Sylvia Pankhurst returns to Britain after that 1912 tour, that second tour of the United States. Because she returned to a very changed political situation. When she left in 1912, it looked as though women might be on the verge of winning the right to vote in Britain. But while she was here, the British government destroyed the chances of that bill getting through Parliament. And so in response, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst organised their activists to go down to the West End of London, then as now an area with lots of the big department stores. And they organised them to go down there with hammers. And at a particular time, these women pulled out their hammers and they smashed all the windows of those massive department stores. Now, for this mass coordinated attack on private property, Emmeline Pankhurst faced potentially a very long period of imprisonment indeed. To escape the same fate, Christabel Pankhurst fled into exile in Paris. And this is the situation that Sylvia confronts on her return. And what she decides to do is to seize control of the suffragette movement and to move it away from that elitism and to make it into a mass democratic campaign. She organises a huge series of demonstrations around the country, but what she also does with a friend of hers, a woman called Ellie Emerson, she goes to East London, then as now one of the poorest parts of London, and she establishes a branch of suffragettes there. So as part of that organisation that her mother and sister were involved with, but this campaign would involve working class women, and it would put working class women absolutely at the heart of campaigning for their political rights. Now, for doing that, at the beginning of 1914, Sylvia Pankhurst, her friend Ellie Emerson, and the whole branch in East London were expelled from the organisation led by Sylvia's mother and her older sister. She was expelled by those family members, and they became separate organisations. Now, the difference between those organisations would be very starkly revealed just a few months later with the outbreak of the First World War. Emmeline and Christabel's organisation suspended the struggle for women's political rights. They supported the British Empire, they supported the British state, and very much supported the war effort, told women they should be going and working in the munitions factories. Sylvia Pankhurst's organisation never ceased to campaign for women's rights, and quite soon that became an explicitly anti-war organisation. But what's interesting to me is that it's at the height of this campaign in East London. It's at making that breach with those elitist politics that for so long she'd been disturbed by. Sylvia Pankhurst was thinking about what she'd done in America. And we know this from the way that the typescript of her book looks. So this is a page from the manuscript. And she's referred to something happening now. There, and then she's put a little asterisk beside it, and then right at the bottom she's written February 1913. Now, in February 1913, Sylvia Pankhurst and her friend Ellie Emerson were very, very busy campaigning indeed. In this month, the two of them committed a number of militant acts, including smashing windows. They were dragged to court, they were found guilty, and they were sentenced to prison. In prison, they were denied the status of political prisoners, and in protest at that, they went on hunger strike. And instead of the authorities then treating them as political prisoners, they force-fed those two women. So essentially a very painful, a very degrading, a very torturous experience for those women to go through twice a day, week after week. Ellie Emerson became so desperate at how she was treated that she tried to cut her wrists, but she was too weak to do it. She said that she got to her arteries and it felt like an elastic band. Sylvia Pankhurst upped the stakes by going on a thirst strike and then on a rest strike, so walking up and down her cell, refusing to sleep until she terrified the authorities into releasing her. In that month, Sylvia Pankhurst was writing about the United States. So there, I think, is a link between this break that she makes with the elitist politics of the suffragette movement or the suffragette leadership in Britain and her contact with America. And I think there's a very, very direct link to that experience indeed. And that is that when Sylvia arrived in the United States, she came at a very dramatic time in American history. She came at a period of huge industrial unrest, where in city after city there was huge strikes taking place. And very often these strikes were being led by working class women, many of them from immigrant backgrounds. And Sylvia encounters this campaign when she went to Chicago in January 1911. When Sylvia Pankhurst arrived in Chicago, in 1911. It was in the middle, towards the end actually, of a very large garment workers' strike. This was a strike that involved about 40,000 women. Ostensibly it was a strike over a pay cut, but actually it was a strike over how these women were treated every single day of their lives. This is an image of them on strike, and you can see from their placard, "We are striking for human treatments," that's what their strike was also about. It was about the way that the foreman spoke to those women when they came to work. It was about the fact that the foremen were paid extra if they could get the women to work that much harder. It was about the fact that their already meagre wages were subjected to a series of really punitive fines for such misdemeanors as using too much soap when they washed their hands. So this was a very large strike that spread from factory to factory in Chicago. And it was incredibly bitterly fought. If you went on strike in Chicago in 1911, you would not only expect police brutality, you would not only expect to be arrested and imprisoned for taking that action, but your employer would hire thugs to beat you up. And literally to break your bones, to terrify you out of ever taking any action like that ever again. Now, when Sylvia arrived in that city, there was somebody who was very keen to show her just how hard that struggle had been. And that woman's name was Ellie Emerson. Ellie Emerson was not a garment worker. She was from quite a wealthy background, but she supported the garment workers' strike. She was chairman of the rent committee, which meant that she went round and persuaded all of the landlords in the city not to collect any rent for the whole duration of the strike, to try and give it a chance of succeeding. She also ran a very cheap restaurant so that the women could feed their families, again, to try and give them the best possible chance. And she was, when Sylvia arrived in the city, Ellie Emerson took her to see the prison cells that the garment workers had been locked up in. And of course, it would be Ellie Emerson who follows Sylvia Pankhurst back to Britain in 1912 to set up that group of working class suffragettes in East London. Now, it's not often when you argue that there's a moment in history that people don't really know about, that moment someone takes a photograph. But someone did take a photograph of this moment, and so this is a photograph of the day that Sylvia Pankhurst and Ellie Emerson met. Here they are in Harrison Street Jail. This is in Chicago. This is Sylvia Pankhurst here looking into one of the cells that the garment workers would have occupied. And this here is her friend, Ellie Emerson. And what these two women had in common is they didn't think that working class women weren't clever enough or weren't strong enough or weren't able to organise for their own rights. What these two women identified is that when women, working class women, organised collectively, they were potentially very, very powerful indeed. And that it wasn't the job of other campaigners to go in and do it for them, but for those that wanted them to succeed, what their job was to do was to support them and to further their cause as much as they could. And so what I've argued in the book is that Sylvia Pankhurst's tours of America changed the course of the militant suffragette movement in Britain. I'd like to say just a few things as well about this text, about this manuscript. That I've published. The text itself by Sylvia Pankhurst is really a response to the kind of tours she was expected to give. At the time that she came to America, many of the suffragist leaders were from incredibly wealthy backgrounds. Sylvia was expected to go and speak to very elite audiences. Quite often she was expected to lecture wearing an evening dress. And she started to encounter an attitude that really sort of prompted her to write the book. So to give you a sense of Sylvia Pankhurst speaking next door, this is how the press reported her speech. They said that she thrilled her audience with details of inhuman and brutal treatment suffered by the women of England at the hands of the officers of the law. And So she did, and she would describe how awful it was to be in a British prison, or how awful it was to work in a British factory. And she found that her audiences were absolutely prepared to agree with her that this must be terrible in the old country. But she also found the assumption among her audiences that nothing like that was happening in the United States. That in fact, women wouldn't be locked up in the same way, that women's wages were very, very good in the United States. If they were bad, it was just a few foreign workers that were receiving those wages. And when they became properly Americanized, then they would earn lots of money. They probably wouldn't even need to work because men's wages were just so fabulous over here. Now, this, in a way, was an argument really against granting women their political rights. The logic of this was that capitalism was solving all of the kind of problems that Sylvia Pankhurst was outlining in Britain, and that you wouldn't even need to go and vote because your life would be so wonderful. Now, this is what Sylvia Pankhurst goes out to research. And she goes into factories, she goes into workhouses and prisons, and she interviews ordinary Americans. And those are the voices that come through in this text. It's the anonymous voices of ordinary American people that she went to speak to. Quite often this involved her having to stand up to the people that were hosting her and taking her around. When she went to the South, she was the first British militant suffragette to go to the southern states. When she went to the South, it was at a time when many of the suffragist leaders were making openly racist arguments for women's suffrage. They were essentially trying to win the support of racist politicians by saying women's suffrage will be a way of stopping black voters, thereby completely erasing black women voters from the question, but also just trying to use racism as a way of advancing their cause. When Sylvia went to the South, she went to Nashville, Tennessee, and she received an invitation to go and speak at Fisk University, a university for African American students. And she was told by her hosts that there was no way she could accept that invitation. But she did accept the invitation, and she went and she spoke and she also listened. And that's recorded in the last chapter of the manuscript in a very, I think it's the most haunting chapter of the whole book, where she writes about the southern states, she writes about the Jim Crow laws, she writes about what it was like to be incarcerated. She went around a number of prisons in Nashville. And she really writes about the brutalization and the criminalization of black people in the South. So that's part of what her tour involved. But it was in the course of undertaking this research that she started to draw some conclusions. And that was that women's inferior status, which in the political realm took the form of not being granted the right to vote, meant that in the workplace, employers just believed they could pay them less. And if you can pay someone less, of course, you can make a bigger profit for yourself. And so what she saw was that far from women's work, women's low-paid work being marginal and peripheral to American capitalism, increasingly employers wanted to see a feminized workforce because this meant huge, fabulous profits for them. And so far from this being an unimportant question, low-paid women's work was becoming absolutely central to the way that American capitalism was operating. And this made getting the vote for women more, not less, important. Now, the cost of women not having a voice over their own lives was very starkly revealed to Sylvia by an event that took place just 3 days before she spoke next door. This was something that took place on the 25th of March, 1911, and it took place at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. This was a factory in New York. It made shirtwaists. It was at the top of a high-rise building, too high for the ladders of fire engines to reach. Now, in a workplace like that, employers weren't supposed to lock the doors in a factory. But they did lock the doors in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory because they wanted all of the women at the end of it, and it was mostly a female workforce, they wanted them all to walk out of one door so that they could be searched, just in case they'd stolen anything from the factory floor. But on the 25th of March 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and the workers were trapped. And 146 workers, most of them women, most of them from immigrant backgrounds, were burnt to death or died jumping out of the windows to try and flee the flames. Now, this had a huge effect on Sylvia Pankhurst. As I say, she was in the States when this happened, and she joined the funeral procession, which we have a photograph of here. She took part in this procession and protest at that loss of life. What I'd like to do is finish by reading Sylvia Pankhurst, partly writing about this, but also partly writing about New York and how she encountered it. This is the end of the preface of this previously unpublished work, where she refers to this, but also speaks sort of more widely about New York. And I'll read you some of her words because I think she's a very beautiful writer, and then I'll end with a concluding thought, if that's all right. So this is Sylvia Pankhurst on New York. But even as it is today, how wonderful is New York from some high place at twilight, when the lofty buildings of commerce are fading into obscurity, and one sees not their great walls, faint and shadowy, but their thousand windows like jewels of fire, their golden patterning and the blue fading light cast a compelling glamour over this city of substantial and materialistic trade. It becomes ethereal as a city of dreams, beautiful and calm as the home of supermen. Seeing the city thus, it is strange to remember it on a sad day of mourning, when rain poured from a grey sky and a long procession of saddened work girls marched in their poor black garments to show honour and respect to their comrades burnt to death in an awful fire. A fire that was fatal because ordinary means of exit were inadequate. Fire escapes were too short to reach the factory's monstrous height. And when the girls sprang from the roof, their tender bodies came hurtling down with an impelling force that tore the sheets held out for them to shreds. As one travels over that vast continent of America, teeming with wondrous natural resources, with endless possibilities of new growth, one sees, as in our older and more crowded land, everywhere the cruel waste of precious human energy and the crushing out of fragile, tender things. One sees, perhaps more clearly than in any other country, new ideals of civilization striving with the old. The sharp, impersonal, pitiless commercial enterprise that everywhere crushes out the slothful inexactitudes and rough, spasmodic kindlinesses and brutalities of the past, and would in its turn make the human beings that it uses ever more machine-like. One now sees faced with the new upspringing of public thought and action that shall place higher than all else the happiness and development of human lives. It is because the things with which they deal are symptomatic of growth from the waste and hardship of the old ill-regulated past to the splendid hopes and promises of the future that these chapters have been written. And I think in that beautiful description of New York, you have encapsulated Sylvia Pankhurst's approach to America. On the one hand, she's so excited by it. She's come from stuffy, traditional Britain to this country where anything seems possible, where there are buildings bigger than she's ever seen before, where more is being produced than ever before. But on the other hand, she sees that if all of that wealth is being accumulated just to make a profit for a few, then it's an inhuman system. And for Sylvia Pankhurst, she was somebody who never believed that a small minority in society could make all the decisions on behalf of everybody else. She always believed that ordinary people should be able to determine the kind of society that they lived in, how resources were distributed, and should have power over their own lives. And it was that principle, I think, that underpinned that lifetime of activism. So thank you. So I guess we should we could maybe have a bit of a sort of informal conversation now, really, if that's okay, and then maybe we could get a drink upstairs. So how do you normally do this? Sure. Okay, cool. Yeah. So I guess if you want to ask questions, ask away, or if you've got things that you want to say or things that you want to share, I'd obviously love to hear that.
So I have like 2 questions.
Sure.
So the first one's like a little more kind of specific, and the second one is a little more general.
Sure.
The first is I'm curious if like Sylvia Pankhurst had any like kind of ongoing communication with other like prominent women in the labor movement, like Lucy Parsons or Elizabeth Flynn or Emma Goldman, and like what the nature of that was, if that was a thing. And the second one is I've read like I guess transcripts from like British politicians like 1918 or something about the suffrage vote and all this. And, they like seem pretty openly like pretty scared that like if we don't grant the vote, they're gonna come in and kill all of us. And which great. I'm wondering if you could talk about the differences between like the British suffrage movement and the American suffrage movement that produce like kind of different responses among people in power.
Sure. Shall I use the microphone? So is that okay? Yeah, thank you. Those are really, really great questions. In terms of the women that she kept up with, not really the ones that you were mentioning, but I think, and I think in a way, women, for example, like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, they do speak on the same platform, by the way. So chapter 1 is about a laundry workers' strike, and they both speak together to those women. But and I suppose Sylvia's politics would actually get sort of closer to a sort of syndicalism in a way, a bit later on. In this period, however, she's obviously very much placing an emphasis on the right to vote, and trying to ally kind of an economic and social struggle with a political struggle. So it was women who were also kind of involved in some way in the suffrage struggle that she particularly worked with or got quite close to. So Rose Schneiderman, she did a speaking tour in the Mohawk Valley with Rose Schneiderman, who was a trade union organizer in New York, and also campaigned for women's suffrage. She also spoke alongside Pauline Newman, who herself had worked in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And in fact, when Sylvia spoke with Rose Schneiderman, both of them referred to what happened there as an argument for women's suffrage. So she was in touch with women like that. Also, she was particularly inspired by women that worked in the settlement houses, partly because looking for people that were trying to campaign for things from below, she was very much inspired by the fact that those women, she felt, had a real knowledge of what it was like to be poor, and what it was like to be in need of services. So in particular, the more sort of radical settlement houses she was impressed by. So Hull House in Chicago, she was really a big admirer of Jane Addams. Ellie Emerson was a settlement worker, and of course becomes this very close and important friend. In New York, the Henry Street settlement, she becomes very good friends with Lillian Wald, who she was very inspired by. And what's kind of interesting is that when she goes back to Britain, she will kind of keep writing to these women. Another two that she was quite inspired by were Alice and Irene Lewison, who were, again, they were very wealthy women, but they were involved with the settlement in New York. And what they did, those two, was to set up what became the neighborhood playhouse. So it's kind of really famous, very avant-garde theatrical dance project that produced some really kind of avant-garde artists. And for Sylvia, I mean, you know, she herself was an artist. That was her training. And for her, I think it wasn't just about getting economic gains, but her kind of prime motivation from a very young age to become a socialist was that she wanted everyone to have beautiful lives and access to art and culture and those things. And so I think she was so impressed at the Henry Street settlement that was very important. What's interesting, I think, as well, is that when she's organising against fascism in the 30s, that she starts to write to some of these women again that she met on tour, and to try and enlist them. She tried to kind of create these sort of women's campaigns against fascism. And she wrote to Rose Schneiderman, she wrote to Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was a suffragist, Alice Stone Blackwell, women like that. So, yeah, these were long-term and enduring contacts. And in terms of the second question about the differences between these struggles, and yeah, I mean, certainly in Britain, I think you're right. The narrative that we're given is that women worked really hard in the war, and a very grateful government gave them the right to vote. That's all women needed to have done. They've just been a little bit more patriotic, they would have got the vote. Obviously, that's just nonsense. And I think you're right. The vote is granted in this period of huge strikes, of revolutions, and I think the government were absolutely petrified that they needed to be able to concede something. That kind of wave of militancy had ignited in Britain in a very, very serious way. They sent tanks into Glasgow, they sent tanks up to Liverpool. There really was a fear there was going to be a revolution in Britain. But the interesting thing is this: I'm not sure they were totally scared about the reigniting of a suffrage struggle again, because I think the fact that Emmeline and Christabel, the fact that at that moment they decided to back the war, as did the peaceful suffragists, also backed the First World War. I think that really kind of meant they'd blunted their weapon. It wasn't going to work anymore. It can't just be reignited at will. They showed where their priorities were. They showed that when push came to shove, they would give up the struggle for women's rights. And what Sylvia was doing, I think, was, had she had more time, I think the story would be very different. I think the fact that she was trying to work with a massive working class revolt in Britain that was a bit like what was happening in the US, also the struggle for freedom in Ireland, those are the forces actually that create the conditions for women's suffrage being granted. It's the fear of those things kind of coming together. And in the US, I think it's fascinating that all through this period, Sylvia's going around America talking about militancy, and lots of the suffragists are very nervous about this. Some of them think it's great. They get the women to talk about being in prison, and loads of people will turn up to your meeting. But others of them thought that women like Sylvia just discredited the cause. They made women look hysterical and irrational, and they didn't want them to be invited. But the movement kind of does become militant in the US, and it's a lot of the women that Sylvia met. But I think it's quite interesting, the movement becomes militant, which really what we're talking about is quite an extensive level of state brutality, once America joins the First World War. So in a way, when the American state behaves like the British state, and interestingly, you don't get all of the American suffragists giving up their struggle. In fact, you get them picketing the White House and trying to expose the hypocrisy about, a war for democracy. And that's when you get the women being suffering an experience that's very close to the British experience. They're imprisoned, they're locked up in workhouses, they're force-fed. This is very, very similar. And I think there's no coincidence that the two states behave in that way. And I think probably the American state did feel quite threatened by that. I think that's why they treated them in that way. So I think there are similarities, but they happen in different ways. And I guess that before the First World War, and before America joins the First World War, in America it still seemed possible to do it through a constitutional route because some states had granted women suffrage. So that, I think, is what the difference is. Yeah, I don't know if that properly answers what you were asking for. Okay, cool. Yes.
So I'm curious. I don't know British history all that well. When did women win suffrage in Britain? And can you answer that quickly? Like, when did women win suffrage?
It's in two stages. So 1918, women over the age of 30, men had it at 21. Again, this very much supports your argument. It was a terrified ruling class. They enfranchised older women, I think, and that had never been on the cards before. That was quite new. I think because they feared the kind of women actually who had done that war work, who had worked in the factories. And then 10 years later, 1928, women get it on the same terms as men.
So I guess my question is, what did Sylvia Pankhurst do after the suffrage struggle was, won? I'm thinking about it in terms of like Emma Goldman's attitudes about suffrage, where, of course, she would never oppose the work, the struggle for it, but she was under no illusions that winning it was going to really solve very much and systematically. So what was Sylvia Pankhurst like? What did her work consist of after that, and was it did her politics change, or what were they to begin with? What was her attitude towards suffrage?
Sure. I suppose the thing is that by the time partial women's suffrage is granted in Britain, her attentions have gone elsewhere. And in fact, she really doesn't think that you can achieve change through Parliament in a way that she perhaps believed in the course of the struggle. Partly, I think that's because the way she was envisaging winning suffrage was in quite a radical way. She envisaged this being forced upon the government, and I think had it been won in those conditions, the sort of potential for that to be a more sort of radical piece of reform, there would have been greater space for that. But the key thing is that the Russian Revolution's broken out. She was tremendously inspired by the Soviets in particular, where she saw this as a far kind of superior form of democracy. So instead of just like every 5 years getting the chance to elect some capitalist politician who's just going to misrepresent you for those 5 years and then you get to pick someone else, what she saw in the Soviets were directly elected representatives who could be recalled the minute that they didn't represent the people that had put them there, and that these were elected from places of kind of working class collectivity and peasant collectivity. So they were elected by the peasants, they were elected in workplaces, they were elected in army battalions because Russia was at war in 1917. And she just saw this as profoundly superior to Parliament. So that's what she was aiming for. Really the sort of substance of her debate with Lenin is about this question. Neither of them thought that you could get socialism through Parliament, and this is the kind of development of Pankhurst's thought, that by then she's kind of rejected that view. She did believe that it had to be achieved through revolution, and that would be that would kind of create its own new democratic forms. Where they disagreed was that Sylvia Pankhurst therefore thought that any kind of involvement with political parties that did believe you could get socialism through Parliament would be to mislead working class people. And so in a way she got to a position where she was arguing that the Labour Party in Britain was even worse than the Conservative Party because it was fooling people. What Lenin was saying was that the Labour Party is the party that millions of working class people engage with. You need to have the argument inside the Labour Party, and you can't not have that dialogue and not try to win people over. But she didn't agree with that. So that was the debate that they had. And essentially, yeah, she didn't really believe after the Russian Revolution that you could just get socialism just by voting the right people in. But because of that position that she'd taken, I think, without sort of working with people more widely, that was quite a sort of isolating experience for her. And that's why she left the Communist Party, and was a bit isolated. But I think in fact, what happens is that she becomes sort of re-engaged, and I think a very relevant figure for us again, with anti-fascism, and she doesn't take she was most certainly, after the Russian Revolution, she was a left communist, but she doesn't take the position that a lot of those people took towards the rise of fascism, which I think was a very complacent attitude, which was an attitude that, oh, well, this is an attack on bourgeois democracy and we hate that, so the sort of after Hitler us thesis. She never thought that. She was never complacent about fascism, and she realised that was the main enemy. And in fact, then she is able to work with other figures to try and oppose the rise of fascism. So that, I suppose, is her sort of political evolution immediately after that period. Yes.
So you talked about this split in thinking between her mother and her sister and Sylvia, which then led to her sort of being kicked out of their group and having her own. How did that play out in all of their later lives? Did they ever understand each other, or was it just this endless schism?
Yeah, it's a very sad story, I'm afraid. It did really last a lifetime. In fact, there were 3 Pankhurst daughters. So the picture that you saw only has 2 of them in there. There was another one, a younger daughter, Adela. Adela, a bit like Sylvia, was a socialist for a while. Later on, her politics changed drastically. But in this period, she was a socialist. She got ill in the course of suffragette campaigning, and her mother bought her a one-way ticket to Australia. So that's what happened to Adela. Sylvia was obviously was expelled. She argued with her mother and her sister about their support for the war, to no avail. And then what really kind of is the sort of final breach was in 1927, when Sylvia had a child. She refused to get married to the father of her child. She didn't believe in marriage. And because of that, because she'd had a child out of wedlock, and her mother at this point, if we think about how much she changed, her mother was at this point standing for the Conservative Party for Parliament. Her mother felt that this was a personal attack, and she refused to. Sylvia went to see her with her young son, and she refused to see Sylvia or her grandchild. So that was a very, very painful breach between the 2 of them. That was, I think, far more painful than the split between Sylvia and Christabel. That was, of course, personally painful. They didn't really ever kind of meet properly again after their mother's death. Although there's a few letters that Sylvia's son Richard actually published between the 2 of them right towards the end of their lives, essentially just as historians start publishing histories of the movement, and there's libel in there, and so they sort of band together to try and sort of challenge some of the some of the falsehoods that were being printed about them. So they wrote these letters, but they're quite sort of there's never a meeting of minds, but they're polite. But yeah, they weren't able to be a family again. They were the kind of people that weren't able to separate what was happening to them personally, what was happening politically. They were so deeply involved that was going to be a lifelong breach, really. Well, I mean, I would suggest if nobody else has got any questions they want to kind of ask in this format, that maybe we could have continue this conversation upstairs in quite an informal, happy way. Does that sound good? Oh, thank you. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming.